Hello all, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale Armortek M4A4 Sherman tank. Since the last video, a lot of progress has been made to the model's lower hull, and we'll be going over these modifications and upgrades in this video. In the previous video, I mentioned that the transmission cover was complete, however needed one or two missing details to fully finish it off. Those missing details have been added, and now the transmission cover is now 100% complete with the exception of the final drives. Starting with the model's casting and foundry marks, a common question that I get on my builds is exactly what do you use for your casting and foundry marks? The answer is I use the Plastruct plastic letters and numbers. I've been using this set now since I started building 1/6 scale tanks since about 10 years now. And the sets are offered in several different sizes, from small to medium to large. The two sets that I like to use personally on these models are the PABT4 for the smaller numbers, and for the larger ones, I like to use the size that's slightly larger. All these numbers are present on the website, and you can order direct from them. The foundry and casting marks themselves gives a nice level of realism and level of detail to the model, which really makes it stand out. In addition to the casting numbers, if we notice, all of the cast texture that was added in the previous video begins to shine once the paint has been applied. The cast texture also helps breaking up the tank's texture and the monotony of the model, in that you have smooth surfaces and cast textured surfaces, which would have been present on the real vehicle. Moving our way to the top portion of the transmission cover, if we notice, I completed the missing detail that was added on this portion here. If we recall from the previous video, the Armortek transmission cover ends at this point right here, and these bolts, which are used to affix the transmission cover to the hull, were just bolted from the glacis plate directly into the transmission cover, which mounts on the inside. This strip here is present on the real Sherman, and to fabricate it, a simple dummy piece was fabricated. What you see here is just a simple strip of plastic that had its holes for the transmission cover mapped and drilled out. That is then simply glued to the surface of the model. And as for the flange connection pieces here, they are each consists of two pieces of 1/8" thick styrene, which are glued together and then fitted to the transmission cover. If we notice, I continued with the flange by using two separate pieces and did not try to do any body work to fuse them together as one. This fully gives the impersonation that each of these pieces is separate from one another, from the top all the way down to the bottom. The final element in completing this strip is adding body work and putty work to the seams, which seals the piece, making it one piece, thus completing the illusion that the transmission cover is one unit. Another modification that was made to the front was the addition of the bow M1919 machine gun. As we recall from the previous video, this 1919 cutout is absent from the Armortek kit. This is because the Armortek kit was intended to be a Firefly, as the British Firefly did not have the M1919 present. The reason for this was because of the 17-pounder gun, more ammunition was required to be stowed inside the vehicle. Because of the longer rounds of the 17-pounder, the entire assistant driver's position was eliminated, and that includes both the interior portion of the machine gun mount as well as the chair and all the other equipment on the inside. All that space was dedicated to the storage of the longer rounds of ammunition. Because of that, the 1919 was deleted, and if you look at all Fireflies, there is a big steel plug welded in this location here. Armortek, since this model is being a Firefly, included a large steel plug that would have been, a large aluminum plug that would have been bolted to this area over here. Since I am backdating the model from a Firefly to an M4A4, the hole was needed to be added. To add the hole, I used a hole saw, like this unit here, to simply drill into the aluminum. Once the aluminum plug was removed, I then had the hole and had to rework it to make it that of the 1919. I had to add the bevel along the lower portion here of the plate, as well as the plug itself. For the plug, I used a piece of PVC which was filled with resin and turned down so that I have the mounting equipment for the 1919 bow machine gun, which will be added later on in the build. As for the top portion here, this was sculpted out of a sculptable epoxy, and more will be added as the build continues and once I really start focusing on this area of the build. One modification that I needed to do before I was able to get the model's interior and exterior lower hull ready for painting was the addition of making the bow driver and co-driver hatch wells fit into the plate. The original kit, the two pieces that are made out of CNC aluminum do not fit into the welds over here, and some material needs to be removed from the bow hatch well. The reason why I went ahead and did this modification now was because later on during the build, when I start moving up to the upper hull, all of the electronics are going to be completed on the inside. If the electronics are completed on the inside, drilling these out creates a lot of filings, which is going to get very messy and could possibly fall into the motor or into the other electrical equipment, which can cause issues. Taking care of this now solves a lot of headaches to happen from further down the road. The two hatch wells simply bolt into this section here, and then the top deck would then bolt directly to them, just thus ensuring a nice strong bond throughout and gives a lot of structural support throughout the rest of the model's deck. More will be talked about this as the build continues. And here's the interior of the model currently with the top deck and turret removed. As we can see, the interior is all primed with its primer base coat, and it is a thorough coating throughout from fender to rear fender. As we can see, there are a lot of fasteners mounted to the bottom of the hull. These are all new additions, and we will be going over all of these additions in this video. And here's the model with its belly painted with its base coat. In addition to applying the base coat of olive drab, the entire model, both exterior and the interior, was painted with the equipment grade primer that we see here, where the final drives are going to go. The primer is needed on these large-scale models, but more so with these radio-controlled large-scale models, because it helps the paint stick better to the surface, which is needed due to all of the scratching risk that is present on these radio-controlled vehicles. In addition of the base coat being added to the model's lower hull, we also see that all of the lower hull axis cap detailing has been added. All these details are scratch built and are not included with the original Armortek kit. Starting with the sponsons, we can see that the welds have been added and are sculpted on via two-part epoxy. The welds service two functions. First, they give the model a little bit more rigidity and help hold it together a little bit better. But two, the most importantly, is that they eliminate the gaps which were left behind from way the plates are all bent and folded together. If we recall from the previous video when I had the hull bolted up, there were several gaps in between the hull plates due to the way the model is designed to be assembled. With adding the welds, you add both the detail element as well as removing any of the gaps left over from the hull plates. Towards the rear portion here of the sponson, we have a small axis cap. This axis cap is present on both sides of the vehicle and are found on all variants of the M4 Sherman family. In fact, these axis caps themselves are a carryover from the M3 Lee. I'm not sure as to what the purpose of these axis caps are. However, I can tell you that my guess is that it has to do with the fuel tanks, and that the fuel tanks are located in this portion here of the rear of the vehicle. While we're on the subject of the fuel tanks, we see here a row of small fasteners along the rear edge of the underhull. The purpose of these fasteners is it's for a bracket which would help align the fuel tank when fitted inside the vehicle. If we notice that the bolts and the fasteners themselves are not in a equal spacing with each other, and this is as per the real vehicle. In fact, specific care was taken and measurements were taken to get the bolts in the following locations. This is a mirror image on the reverse side, and this boat includes the bolts, but as well as the bolt gapping that we see here. From what I've seen, this feature is only present on the M4A4 Sherman. On the front portion here of the sponson, we see a plate that is bolted to the sponson itself. This plate is intended for the front mud flaps, which will be fabricated and mounted to these 3 holes here as the build continues. Moving our way to the transmission cover, if we notice, the cover is affixed to the hull with a row of fasteners. This row of fasteners here is present on the kit. However, the fasteners that the kit requires you to use are these cap screws. The cap screws themselves are not accurate for the Sherman in that the real tank had hex bolts fitted in their place. So rather than using the cap screw, I simply replaced the cap screw with the hex bolts, thus improving accuracy of them. Also, moving our way to the top portion, or actually the bottom plate of the hull, we see here that more details have been added to the kit transmission cover. These 3 bolts here are actually drainage plugs and are found on the real vehicle. And if we notice, each separate casting of the transmission flange has its own drainage plug. There are several drainage plugs along the lower portion of the transmission cover. If we notice, there's another one here in the center and 2 on either end of the final drive mounts. Moving our way back, we have here another row of fasteners. Just like the fasteners that go along the side of the hull here, the fasteners on top were requested by the kit to use cap screws. Instead of using the cap screws, I also substituted those for the hex bolts. In addition to substituting the bolts, the Armortek kit only had about 4 of the bolts required that hold the transmission cover on. The number of bolts and the type of fasteners they use is adequate at doing its job. However, because I will be detailing the underbelly of the model, I needed to both swap out the cap screws and add the proper number of bolts required for the model. Moving on from the welds, we have here a very important part of the Sherman, which is the escape hatch. This little hatch here saved a lot of crew members' lives when the tank got hit. The way this escape hatch worked was there was a little lever on the inside, and when the lever is rotated, the entire escape hatch drops out, allowing the crew to escape from the bottom of the vehicle. In addition to the escape hatch itself is fabricated out of a piece of Lexan and is bolted to the model via countersinks. Because of the nature of this radio control model, all of the pieces have to be bolted to the hull to ensure that the pieces are on nice and strong, as again, this whole area here is going to be very susceptible to brush and debris rubbing against it, which could knock off a part that is just simply glued on. In addition to the escape hatch, we see a lot of drainage holes mounted to the bottom of the model. These drainage holes here are positioned on almost every single portion of the vehicle and are really helpful in draining any extra rainwater that would accumulate on the inside if the hatches were left open. Moving our way to the underhull rigidity strips. This is a feature found on all Sherman tanks, as well as it's a carryover from the M3 Lee. The Sherman tanks all had these rigidity strips affixed to the bottom plate. What they do is they give the bottom more structural integrity and prevent the hull from yawing under the stress of the suspension. They're always found in the same 2 locations. We have one in this covering the center bogey system, and then we have a second one in the rear portion here of the suspension. If we notice that the rear rigidity strip is not evenly placed over the suspension housing, this is as per the real vehicle. Also, as we notice, the rigidity strip itself is a rounded half-cut pipe. This is present on earlier production versions of the Sherman tank. The rounded design is a carryover from the M3 Lee. The only difference is that on the M3 Lee, it was riveted to the lower hull, like the rest of the fabrication on that tank. And on the Shermans, it was welded. On the later production Shermans, they replaced the rounded tube with a piece of angle iron that ran along the same locations we see here. The pieces themselves are fabricated out of a length of PVC pipe that was cut in half and sanded flush. To affix the pipe to the model, 3 holes were drilled and were countersunk. Fasteners were then placed into the tube, affixing it to the hull. Once the fasteners were mounted, the holes were plugged up via the bodywork and sanded flush. This is done for both of the rigidity strips. Moving our way to the rear portion of the underhull, we see a myriad of axis panels. These panels here are present on all Shermans, but are different shapes because of the different engines, as these panels here are intended to get access to the engine and engine compartment from under the vehicle. Because this tank is an M4A4 and is affixed with the Chrysler multi-bank radial engine, it features this layout that we have here. On the M4A3 and as well as the other Shermans, they, depending on the different engines, depends on the axis panels found on the lower hull. These axis panels that you see here are a detail upgrade set that I just posted on eastcoastarmory.com, and the set comes with the 3 panels here as well as the large blister panel that we have here. The set also includes the small axis cap, and in addition to this set, the small sponson axis caps that we have here on either side of the sponson are also found on the eastcoastarmory.com product line, however are not included with this M4A4 engine hatch set that we have here. Because of the large radiator and propeller that is required to keep the engine cool, the multi-bank engine was so big that it still didn't fit inside of the stretched out Sherman hull. Because of that, on the bottom and the top, 2 blisters were fabricated and mounted to the tank to allow the whole engine system to fit in. Over here, this blister here actually covers up the lower portion of the radiator fan, which dangles below the radiator, thus requiring the use of the blister. In addition to the resin set, the set also includes the fasteners to mount them to the hull. All these fasteners that you see here are not only detail, but are actually real bolts that are used to bolt it to the lower plate. You simply mount the panel onto the model. A drop of glue could help in alignment. And then once the glue sets, you just drill out the steel plate or the lower hull plate to insert the fasteners. Because of the blister, how it overhangs from the bottom, I drill a separate hole in the center of it to mount a single fastener all the way through. This single fastener was then covered up with the bodywork, and the purpose of the single fastener is because of, again, the high hazard of getting impacted by objects. The extra fastener helps to make the piece stronger in that if the piece hits something, it is very less likely to crack because of the extra structural support of the extra fastener. Like I said earlier, once the fastener was mounted, it was then deleted with the bodywork. Moving our way towards the rear of the model, we have here another modification that was made that differs from the kit. This being the addition of the round back as opposed to the straight back, which is found on the Armortek kit. You can see how the Armortek kit originally looked with the straight back. The Armortek kit, as was mentioned in the first video, was the lower plate was one solid plate that was just bent via break into the shape that we have here. The straight back design is more prevalent on other versions of the Sherman design, namely the M4, the M4A2, but more specifically the M4A3. On the M4A4, however, it seems that from all of the reference images I have, that the rear plate had a rounded off design, as opposed to the straight back, which is found on later production units. To add the round back modification, The way it was done was I took a PVC pipe and I cut it so that it fits onto the plate. Once I had the tube cut and sanded so that it was nice and flush on either end, I drilled 3 holes into the PVC tube, and just like with the rigidity strips, mounted 3 fasteners. The fasteners bolt the PVC pipe to the Armortek hull, and then with the use of the bodywork are sanded flush. In addition to adding the bodywork to remove the fastener holes, bodywork was also applied here to fill in the gap left over from the hollow pipe. After the bodywork was done, it was sanded nice and smooth, and it leaves for a near flawless finish on the side of the model, which gives the illusion that the Armortek kit has the round back built into the laser cut panels. In addition to the bodywork, the welds were also added, which are present on the real vehicle. The welds also plug up any holes and give the illusion that the rounded back is part of the Armortek kit. If we notice here on these 2 sections of the hull, the seams still remained. This is because these seams are going to be covered up by the rear idler mounts once fitted. Just like with the suspension, this area was left void of any weld beads because of the final drives need to fit nice and flush to the model's hull. Once the final drives are fitted, the welds all line up and the illusion is complete. As for the toe eyes, those are my own original versions and are made out of resin. The resin toe eyes have a metal rod in them that plug into the PVC pipe, and then in addition to being glued with the metal rod on the inside, welds were sculpted on the outside, which both aid in giving detail as well as structural support. Another side note, this model here, if we notice, does not have a tow hitch mount. The tow hitch mounts came later on and are not present on the original M4A4s. In fact, if you go on the net and you look at preserved M4A4s either on display as monuments or as refitted as Fireflies, you will notice that there's no tow hitch extender or any type of tow hitch mounts fitted to this portion here. Later on, other versions of the Sherman did have the tow hitch mount welded to this portion here of the hull, and as for the lack of a tow hitch, this is also another carryover from the M3 Elite. And that concludes this project update video for this 1/6 scale Armortek M4A4 Sherman tank. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook. And don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 scale tank builds, as well as other 1/6 scale detail components. Thank you.